Welcome to the Human Flourishing Project. I'm your host, Alex Epstein. So it's the day after Thanksgiving. I hope everyone had an enjoyable Thanksgiving, and Thanksgiving actually relates to the topic of today. Not Thanksgiving in general, but my Thanksgiving in particular, because the topic today is when to work too hard. When to work too hard. And the impetus of this is two basic things. One is that on this show, I have advocated many times in different forms the idea that a flourishing life involves a certain kind of balance or integration of creation, rejuvenation, and recreation. And that, particularly with creation, which is how I classify work, it's very possible to do that, to spend an amount of time on that where it goes from something that's very enjoyable and part of an enjoyable life to a point where it can be fatiguing and just not nearly as enjoyable. So in economics, there's this idea of diminishing returns, and this diminishing returns is true of a lot of things in life. Just in general, the idea that, you don't, the more of something you do, the less value you get per unit of doing it. So diminishing returns in work, you can think of it as, if my 11th hour of work, I might not be able to get as much work done. That's one way you could look at it, but I actually think it's worse, because I think there's from an enjoyment perspective, I think that working too much, as I call it, can yield negative returns. It can really color the whole experience. So I think a lot about how do I structure and plan my life such that I'm doing the level of creation that I want, but I'm not doing too much of it. And that will be individual to the person, and it'll depend on a lot, but you can often feel it. I certainly can, when it's just, I'm not as motivated to do this. I feel like in some ways my work is not as good. I don't feel like I have as high level of perspective, as much altitude on it as I would like. And it's not overall as good an experience. And so that's point one, is that just I'm an advocate of really limiting time on creation in a way that's consistent with flourishing. And I've talked in different episodes about how I really evaluate myself that way. So I used to consider it a success when I was just pushing myself to the absolute limit. And I would think, if I'm doing that, that's good. And if I'm not, it's suspect. And now when I push myself past a certain limit, I feel like, I did not set this up properly. This is not the way I want to be living consistently. And then that relates to the second point, which is that as I've somewhat at least indicated on this show in the past couple months, I've been working very hard on a book deadline. And then in the last 20 days in particular, I've worked hard every day the last 20 days. So I don't usually, I basically never work that many days in a row. And then it was a very, very high intensity. And so when this happens, I think a lot about, okay, how do I decide when I'm going to do this and when I'm not? And so I have some thoughts on that, and I think it's worth it for those of you listening to think about this as well. Now, because there's definitely the phenomenon of the way I think of it is, there are some times that I do want to work harder than I would ideally like to work. And when I say ideally like to work, that basically means that in a situation, in terms of how I want to work the long term of my life, in situations where there's not financial need to work a lot more. And that's kind of one case where you do want to work too hard. And then also where there's not some one-time value that's very time sensitive that makes it worth it to work too hard. So in business, there's this idea of a one-time expense. When companies are reporting their earnings, sometimes they'll say, we didn't earn as much as we thought in profit or as you expected, but it was just a one-time expense. We had to do something, and we're not going to have to do it in the future, but it was worth doing it now. And I think of working too hard as a kind of one-time expense. So if, for instance, when I was starting my business, I was working all the time, and part of that is I needed some kind of income, and I didn't really know what would work. And so it was worth it to do that. And I remember at earlier times in my career when I was struggling, sometimes I would think, yeah, you know what, I was just so focused on, yeah, I got to get exactly the right amount of sleep. And if I don't sleep enough, then I would lie in bed and try to sleep more in the morning. And at a certain point, I just thought, you know what, okay, sleep is important. And yeah, ideally I'll be getting a better balance of it. But the main thing I have to do right now is work, because that's the priority. So it's worth it to work harder than I would ideally like. And then another kind of situation is, and that's the one I'm classifying myself in now, is there's a time sensitive value. So in my case, I would like to get a book out on a certain date, and there's value to me in it being out earlier rather than later, in part because there's an election next year, and that election is going to have energy as a major issue, and I would like to have influence on how people are thinking about energy when they're voting and making different kinds of policies. And so that is, to me, that makes it worth it to work harder. Otherwise, I would delay it and take a more relaxed kind of timetable. But I'm aware when I do this, I really try to think, is this really a one-time expense? And I think that's something worth thinking about. You think this happens with evaluating corporations as well. You think with a company, if they say this is a one-time expense, sometimes investors say, yeah, but you've been taking a lot of one-time expenses. And with working too hard, it's very, very possible to say, oh, well, this warrants this one-time expense, and this warrants this one-time expense. And then suddenly you're always just pushing yourself to the limit and being in that state where it's not really enjoyable. And the best way I know how to protect myself against this is to really keep in mind that my standard is not that I want to do as much work as imaginable. I want to have a creative life where I enjoy it in a sustained way over a long period of time. And there are so many benefits to having it in a way where the creative work is consistently enjoyable over time. That's ultimately going to lead to better work. It's going to lead to more satisfying work. And one won't get the feeling of, oh gosh, I was just pushing myself all the time and I missed out on all kinds of other stuff. Sometimes people think of it that way. They'll think, well, I didn't spend time with my family that I wanted to spend, or I didn't do this activity I wanted to do. And that's definitely part of it, that one is excluding certain kinds of things. But the one that stands out most to me is just that the work is not as satisfying and enjoyable if it's in this state of too high intensity. Now, one variable that can come into play when deciding whether to work too hard is level of motivation. And so for example, in the last 20 days, for a lot of it, I've had an unusually heightened level of motivation, in part because there was a deadline and in part because I have a positive motivation for meeting the deadline. And I think that the more it's a positive motivation, hey, I really want this done by this date, that would be exciting, versus, oh, my life is going to end if I don't hit this, the more it can be, oh yeah, my mind will go in more of a peak state, and I'll be making more connections. And there have definitely been days during this 20-day period where I felt like, yeah, I want to work on this. That's the only thing I want to do. I'm super motivated. I'm percolating. I keep making all these connections, and I don't want to stop. I don't want to stop the mental continuity that I have. But this morning, certainly this morning, and really a little bit the past couple of days, I would start to lose that. And I think, yeah, I'm getting fatigued. I'm getting to the point where I don't want to be working at this intensity. I really need to take some time off. So I'm taking off after this, and after I do maybe an hour more work, I'm going to take off the rest of the day and then take off all of Saturday. And then that should give me a lot of rejuvenation for the deadlines to come. But I think it's a good thing to notice. Yeah, if I'm really motivated, that can be a good time to run with it. And in part, the being motivated makes it a lot more enjoyable, versus if it's just, the more it's pure willpower, the more it's suspect. That being said, I do think I think the ideal combination of abilities is the ability to plan a life of relaxed productivity, but also have the ability to execute with extreme willpower and just push oneself to one's limits when it really matters. So I'm grateful that I've developed the ability to really push myself, but also that I have the standard of this isn't what I want to be doing most of the time. This comes at a cost, and part of the cost is life is not as enjoyable usually when I'm pushing myself, pushing myself to that level, leaving aside those periods of really heightened motivation, and those are great. And assuming you don't have a lot of other things that it's going to be at the expense of, those are great to just ride out and they're fun. And that those will also happen just in periods where there's not a deadline or anything, but just if one is relaxed, productive, and there's just something and just, wow, I'm figuring this out and I'm figuring this out and I'm figuring this out. And so that's the best. So if I could set things up perfectly the rest of my life, I would plan out such that I could be pretty much relaxed, productive all the time, and then have certain kinds of periods of just really, really heightened motivation where I worked, quote, too hard, but not at all because I had to, but just because I really wanted to. And then I would make sure at the end of that, I'd probably get extra rejuvenation and recreation time. One final thought on this. Some months ago, I did a series of shows on someone named Arnold Bennett. And I mentioned in one of the shows, at least, that one thing I really liked about his writing is he's very good at making one recognize how much it matters to find life enjoyable in the present, and how easy it is to treat life as, oh, well, this is something that'll be better in the future, so I don't really need to pay attention to the way it is now. And I think about him a lot with different kinds of activities, and it's really benefited me to think about, am I living my life in a way that's enjoyable, and then maybe it can improve in certain ways, and maybe I'll want more of it, but is this basically an enjoyable process, or am I doing a process that's not going to lead to sustained enjoyment? And then the question is, why am I doing that? Is this a one-time expense that's really worth it? Okay, but then we really need to be cautious about that, because we want to minimize, all things being equal, we want to minimize those one-time expenses. And then one other note about working too hard that connects to some of what I've talked about with relaxed productivity and rejuvenation is that, at least for me, even when I'm pushing myself more than I would like, I almost never work when tired. So I'm just a big fan of do not work when tired. Figure out ways to rejuvenate yourself, because being tired is just hard. So even if I'm working really hard, I might get up at 6 a.m. and then stop working at 6:30 p.m., but I'll make sure to take a big rejuvenating break in the middle of the day. And if I need a nap or if I need to meditate, I'll do that, because I know that to do really good work, I need to be rejuvenated. And as soon as I start working in a fatigued way for an extended period of time, motivation goes down, quality goes down, enjoyment goes down. So even when I'm stringing together 20 days, or I guess, and part of what allows me to do that and for it to be enjoyable at least a lot of the time still is that rejuvenation. So even when one is working too hard, part of the calculation is, I'm going to work too hard, but I'm going to work too hard in a smart way. And of course, I'm using too hard somewhat facetiously, because I'm deciding, it's worth it to work this much, but I'm saying too hard because I want to reinforce to myself, this is not the dominant way to live. This is the exception, not the rule. And then, one more thought on that is and then when one is working too hard, it's good to have the idea of, I don't want to be working this way all the time, but also one wants to have appreciation of, it's pretty cool that I get to do this kind of work. And especially if you're getting to do kind of work that you like I like writing, and I like thinking about trying to clarify different kinds of things. I try to appreciate, this is an intensity that's a little much for me, but there's still a lot about it that's enjoyable, and I'm appreciative that I'm in a world where I can do this kind of work, and I appreciate the effort that I've put in to get myself to this place, and I certainly appreciate the efforts of those who have helped me get to this place. So those are my thoughts this week on when to work too hard. I'm interested in what the audience thinks about this. If you want to comment, you can go to the Facebook page at facebook.com/Human Flourishing Project. If you have any questions, comments, love mail, or hate mail, you can email me at alex@alexepstein.com. No response is promised, but I will read the emails that I get. And if you want the bi-weekly updates announcing when the new shows come out, you can go to humanflourishingproject.com. Also, you can find these episodes on YouTube. Not many people are listening to them or watching them on YouTube, but you can find them there. There's no video, but you can listen to them on YouTube if you want, and certainly you can listen to them on all sorts of different podcast platforms, including Apple Podcasts. Okay, that's it for this week. I will talk to everyone again in 2 weeks. Until then, I'm Alex Epstein. This has been the Human Flourishing Project.